Good morning everyone, my name is Nick and this is Stu the Rabbit, and it's lovely to be with you here this morning. I wonder if you've been learning lots of new skills and developing old skills during the lockdown. Well, Stu here has been learning how to do needlework and sewing. It's not been easy with those little paws, has it? But you've had a go, and he's decided that he wanted to try out his skills by repairing one of my old shirts that had a split in the back of it. He wouldn't let me have a look at it until just now, so now is the moment for the big reveal. It's a bit like the Great British Sewing Bee, but not probably as impressive. Okay, here's the shirt, and it's a shirt, not a pyjama top, and oh my goodness. Can you see the repair? Are you pleased with that? It's fairly obvious. Yeah, okay. Where did you get the patch from? Hold on a minute. Let's put that down. Where did you get the patch from? The shirt I'm wearing. But this is my new shirt. It's nice clean cloth. So where did you get it from? On the back. Let's have a look. Is there a... Oh, it does feel a bit drafty there. Yeah. Thanks so much, Stu. That was really helpful. If you've got to mend anything, you don't buy a new shirt or take a new shirt and cut it up to mend the old one. No, you know that now, don't you? It's a bit of a silly thing to do, isn't it? You know, Jesus told a parable, a story, just about that. About how silly it is if you've got some old clothes and you get new clothes and cut them up to repair the old. The new ones are ruined and the old ones don't look very good. What Jesus was saying in that story is there are things that we can do and ways that we can be that aren't taking on board fully the sorts of things that he came to say and do. It's as if we're just trying to patch up our old way of life with a little bit of Jesus. Whereas actually what he wanted was to offer us a whole new, exciting, vibrant, flourishing way of life. Life in all its fullness, not just patching up the old. So we're going to explore that a little bit more after we hear a reading of those words that Jesus spoke. And you're not going to be back here, are you? You're going to be a distraction. Okay, bye-bye. See you soon.
The Pharisees and teachers of the law said to him, "John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees. But yours go on eating and drinking." Jesus answered, "Can you make the friends of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days they will fast." He told them this parable. "No one tears a piece out of a new garment to patch an old one. Otherwise they will have torn the new garment, and the patch from the new will not match the old. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. Otherwise the new wine will burst the skins. The wine will run out and the wineskins will be ruined. No, new wine must be poured into new wineskins. And no one, after drinking old wine, wants the new, for they say, the old is better."
Welcome back. As we explore this passage, the first thing that we see is that the whole episode started with Jesus being questioned by the religious leaders of his day about the behaviour of his followers. They didn't look like nice, polite churchgoers. They weren't fasting glumly. They were feasting gleefully. And the question that Jesus was asked was, in effect, how come you're not religious like us? Interestingly, fasting, going without food, is only commanded once in the Old Testament, during the Day of Atonement. By Jesus' day, the Pharisees, who were a group of religious fundamentalists, had decided that everyone ought to fast at least 2 times a week. It was their rule, but they thought everyone ought to follow it. How come you're not religious like us? Ordinary people relish being with Jesus. And it's not surprising, is it? In the preceding verses in Luke chapter 5, we would read about a man with leprosy being healed. And Luke says news about him, that's Jesus, spread. We read about a lame man being healed and having his sins forgiven. And Luke says everyone was filled with awe. We read about a tax collector, Levi, who found acceptance from Jesus, left his job to follow him, and threw a party to celebrate. How come you're not religious like us? Jesus did not come to patch up the old ways of living. At first sight, his response to these questions from the Pharisees seems strange, don't they? Why was he talking about weddings? Well, in those days, couples who got married didn't go on holiday somewhere exotic for a honeymoon. They stayed at home for a week of feasting with family and friends. The Pharisees had even said that during that week you didn't have to fast. Now you can see why Jesus used that as an illustration, can't you? If it was okay not to fast when the groom was around during the wedding, then it's okay for people not to fast while he's around. There would be a time when that was no longer the case, when he'd been arrested and crucified and died before he rose again. And his followers would be glum for a time. But now was a time to rejoice. And then Jesus told the 2 mini parables. And the illustrations are both making the same point. You can't mix the old with the new. You can't fix the old by tacking on a little bit of the new. We saw that from what happened with Stu the Rabbit trying to fix my shirt. Patching up an old shirt from new shirts is daft, isn't it? And that's the point. In Jesus' day, they used leather bottles, not glass bottles, for storing wine. But we would not put wine, new wine that was still fermenting, into a glass bottle and seal it up, because the bottle will explode as the gas expands, a bit like when you shake up a bottle of Coke. And in the same way, you wouldn't put new, still fermenting wine into old, inflexible, crusty leather wineskins, because the fermentation produces gas that would burst the wineskin, and the wineskin and the wine would be ruined. You would put new wine into new, fresh leather wineskins that would expand as the wine fermented. It's the same point as with the patches. You'd be daft to put new wine into old wineskins. How come you're not religious like us? Well, Jesus' response was to say he hadn't come to patch up the old way of life, so there's no way it was going to look the same. He'd come to bring in the new. There's been a lot of talk recently, hasn't there, about the new normal, what that might be. Well, I want to suggest that for Jesus, new is normal. When Jesus taught, people described it as a new teaching. He himself spoke of a new commandment, a new covenant, being born again. In him, people saw a new power. They had their lives open to new possibilities. They experienced new hope. They found new status. It's no wonder they partied. Jesus' new way was as different from the old religious systems of his day as a racing car is from a donkey. Jesus was welcoming and inclusive of all. The religious rules excluded all sorts of people. Jesus touched people that the religious rules said were untouchable. He forgave sin. But the religious people of the day decided that only God could do that. They kind of missed the idea that if Jesus was forgiving sin, maybe he was from God. Jesus healed those who were incurable. He brought freedom, whereas the religious rules shackled people. He offered a relationship with God. The religion simply offered ritual. Jesus was life-affirming. Religion was guilt-inducing. And we still have Jesus with us today by his Spirit. So in one sense, it's still time to party because the groom is with us. Yes, we may fast for particular reasons, but followers of Jesus should be known as people who celebrate. I find it fascinating that as we grow older in our faith, somehow many of us lose the enthusiasm and excitement that we felt when we first became followers of him. Is it because we've got used to him? Is it because we've got so many more cares and concerns? Or is it because we've started to become religious? We've started thinking in terms of rules more than relationship. We've started thinking of church rather than following Jesus. If that's the case, have we settled for something less than he's offering? If we've made following Jesus all about coming to church, if our enthusiasm has diminished because we're too busy organising the rotas to spend time listening to him, if we are less willing to talk to others about Jesus because we're worried that our theology might not be right, people might look down on us for getting it wrong, it's frightening to think that even though Jesus had made it so clear that he'd not come to patch up the old religious way of life, but bring something completely new, many of the arguments in the early church were about whether or not they were just patching up the old way of life. Arguments about whether you had to obey the Jewish rules about what you can eat. Arguments about whether men had to be circumcised in order to follow Jesus. And the first big church meeting in Acts 15 was all about that question. And in several of his letters, Paul has to write to early churches to remind them that following Jesus isn't just about patching up the old way of doing things, it's something new. So what might Jesus be saying to us today about these parables? Well, it seems to me that there's something about society there. The worldwide outrage and demonstrations following the murder of George Floyd when a policeman knelt on his neck is a reminder that you can't just patch up an unjust and broken system. The Black Lives Matter movement is a reminder that the justice of Jesus' new kingdom has come for all. Injustice and racism still exist in our society. And when you think about the welcome and inclusion that Jesus offered, those things are a stark and bleak contrast to that, aren't they? Jesus calls us to follow him and emulate him with the welcome, the inclusion, the love that we express. And we should fight against racism in our country as much as anybody else, perhaps more so, because we are followers of Jesus. That message that you can't simply patch up a broken system with a little bit of something new speaks loud and clear in this context. But the parables don't just speak to our society, they speak to us in our churches. In fact, given that Jesus spoke these parables to the religious leaders of his day, perhaps we need to take special notice of them as church. The new wine of Jesus' kingdom bursts out of the old wineskins of out-of-date tradition. And we need to search ourselves and see whether our message is more about following rules than being in a relationship with Jesus. I have heard, and I have probably preached, to my shame, sermons which could be summarised as try harder, do better, be nicer. Now, don't get me wrong, we have a part to play in responding to the move and prompting of God's Spirit. But if Jesus is not involved in what we are doing in our churches, there's a danger of us just being a well-meaning self-help programme or support group. Whilst our programmes and groups are suspended during the lockdown, maybe it's a good time for us to check again whether the prime purpose of what we're doing is to share the good news of Jesus. Are our groups and activities and events like a stick of rocks that you could break open at any place and say, it's all about following Jesus. It's all about sharing the good news. Let me try and illustrate what I mean. I was part of a project a number of years ago that was responding to the fact that churches are the biggest providers of parent and toddler groups in the country. But many of them have little or no mention of Jesus. Story time might be the telling of the latest Peppa Pig book. There might not even be prayers. And in the research that was carried out, we were told that organisers didn't want to upset or put off parents from coming by talking about Jesus. But the research then showed that this was not the case. When groups were explicit and said, we follow Jesus and we talk about Jesus and we pray to Jesus and we talk in our story time and sing songs about Jesus, parents loved it. They didn't stop coming at all. And interestingly, in my last church, the most popular parent and toddler group was like that in many ways. Let me give you another thought. Food banks. They're an amazing and vital tool, and sadly all the more important at the moment. That is without doubt. But some are run on church premises. Are they also places where prayer is offered, a listening ear is given, good news about Jesus is shared? It might be, oh, well, that's against the ethos of a food bank. Is it against the ethos of the church? Before the lockdown, many churches were excellent at putting on events. The most obvious one would be our Sunday services, and many of us, and this is a good example, have gone online with those services during the lockdown. But churches also run lots of other activities and events with the hope that people will come to them. People who are not followers of Jesus. Maybe we'll even put on an event and invite someone to come with us. But church is not about inviting people to events. It's about a relationship with Jesus. The early church flourished because it was about relationships. It wasn't about activity. Is the church a community to which you belong or something you go to? I wonder what you're missing about church during this lockdown. And what have you not missed about church? What have you appreciated most during the lockdown? I suspect that a common theme in those answers about what you have missed and what you have appreciated will be relationship. What you're looking forward to probably more than anyone else is being with the people that you love. Sharing fellowship, to use Christian speak. And I wonder whether those questions are helpful questions for us as church to consider as we start to ease the lockdown. Will they help us to discern God's priorities for us? Will they help us to rediscover God's priorities for us? Are we simply patching up the old, or are we going to embrace the new? These parables don't just speak to the whole of society and to church, they speak to us as individuals as well. Do we live as followers of Jesus every moment of every day? Or is our faith more like patching him up with a bit of church on Sunday and then the rest of the week just looks like it always has? God is constantly refreshing our relationship with him. The Bible talks about God's compassions, his mercies never failing, being new every morning. Are there times when we would rather he kept things as they are? Just leave us alone. Don't keep changing us. Don't keep challenging us. When God's Spirit puts his finger on areas of our life that he wants to change, do we resist? Do we come up with the excuses? Or do we allow him to do what he wants? Are we willing to allow him to change us and to work with him to be changed so that we can become more like Jesus? Or are we just happy with the way we are? What Jesus said was hard hitting, wasn't it? It hit hard then, it hits hard today. But do you remember the end of the reading? It seems as if Jesus undermined everything he had been saying. He'd spoken out against the religious people with all their rules and rituals and said you can't patch up the old with a little bit of the new. And you can almost hear his followers calling out, "Amen, preach it, go for it, Jesus." And then he says, "And no one after drinking old wine wants the new, for they say the old is better." What? The old is better? Jesus was parodying the attitudes of those who were resistant to change. They say the old is better. Today you might hear that in phrases such as, "Well, we've never done it that way before," or "We've always done it that way." It's an attitude that's existed amongst humans almost since the beginning of time, I suspect. I can imagine the caveman who first discovered fire being told by his tribe that they've managed perfectly well, thank you very much, and they don't need this newfangled hotness. I can remember as a teenager, I was invited by a friend to go and see the film Grease with John Travolta, Olivia Newton-John, great songs, dance routines, brilliant film. But my friend had said to me, "Do you want to go and see Grease? It's a musical." And in my mind, never having heard of it before, I thought it was an opera about ancient Greece. And I didn't want that. I didn't want that new thing. So I politely declined. How wrong I was. I wonder what Jesus might be saying to us through the lockdown and about what comes next. Will we be resistant to change? Or are we ready to try something new? The Eastern Baptist Association has been having some conversations during this time, asking those sorts of questions, asking what God is saying to us during the lockdown about what comes next. And the responses all focus about the primacy of making disciples. Now, making disciples isn't just about looking after those who are already Christians. Making disciples, if you think about Matthew 28:19, is about helping people to become disciples. It's about both things together. And discipleship is not about programs. We've met online during the lockdown. We've probably connected more with our neighbours physically around us than many of us have done for ever. We've experienced community in a very different way. Church isn't just a series of meetings anymore. And surely that's where true discipleship lies. Discipleship is relational. Relationships are so important to us, and there are many people that we missed greatly. Growing disciples works well in close relationship, in small groups. And as the lockdown unfolds, I suspect that we won't be instantly allowed to go back to big meetings. That actually we may need to start in smaller groups. Well, we could do that now in sixes in our back gardens. But maybe refocusing on small groups for our discipleship and for making disciples, inviting people round to our gardens for barbecues and starting to talk about Jesus, for example. Discipleship happens where God places us. Physically, many of us can't go very far at the moment. So how is God speaking to us where we are? How is God going to use us to disciple those who are physically next door to us or across the road? God wants to use you where you are to make disciples. And discipleship during this lockdown period, I think, means about making new connections. We've learnt how to do services online, and it seems from the research that a lot more people are tuning in to our services online than would normally turn up on a Sunday morning. What does that tell us about what we should be doing after the lockdown? Other churches who don't have many people who can engage online have created newsletters for their community, or they've hand-delivered printouts of the sermons to different people. Some have even set up phone lines so you can phone up and listen to a sermon. How can we best take advantage of these opportunities God has given us? Maybe after the lockdown, part of discipleship will remain online. Perhaps we'll have two congregations, a real one and a virtual one. Discipleship, though, still means listening to God and going deeper with him. That never changes, even though the context changes. And the question remains, are we going to patch things up or try to fit new wine into old wineskins? Or are we ready to listen to God, to embrace the new things he has for us and go deeper in our relationship with him? God bless you.